Hello everyone. So in our last video, I showed you how to install Python and also get it integrated with VS Code so you can start doing Python development within the editor. Today, what I want to do is show you some of the other tools that are available for making that experience a lot richer and more valuable. What I showed you before was basically how to get Python running either in batch, so where you run your entire Python file as a single script, and also how you can open up an interactive session where you're running your Python code in the regular Python terminal. That's a fine experience for a lot of things, but particularly in the data science space, increasingly it's valuable to be able to get a lot richer interactive output from your Python session. Software engineers are often writing Python scripts that they want to be able to run as full scripts, and so running things from the command line as one big run is fine for them. In data science, we often want the opportunity to be able to run parts of our code and then look at the output so we can get a better sense of our data. In addition, we often also want to be able to do things like create plots and look at visualizations of our data that are immediately available in the interactive session. And the way that most people do that is using tools from the Jupyter ecosystem. Jupyter is a set of tools to provide an augmented interactive experience, not only for Python, but also for people working in R, Julia, or any number of other programming languages. So what I want to do today is two things. First, I want to show you the value of these tools by working with them a little bit in a pre-configured environment, just so you can see why we're going through the trouble of learning these things. And then we're going to stop and I'm going to walk you through the process of setting up these different tools and getting them configured on your own computer so you can do this on your own. So just to make sure that we're starting for the same place that we were before, let's just open up a simple Python file and talk a little bit about what we saw before. So the first thing we saw before is that if we hit this play button up here, what we get is that this entire file is going to be run in batch. It's going to be run as a single large script where VS Code is going to open a Python session, run the file, get the output, and then close the Python session again. This is a really good way for testing and debugging code when you're working in a kind of software engineering framework, right, where you're writing scripts whose job is to be run and executed as a single large script. So oftentimes this is really helpful. Run that once more just so you can make sure we see. There we go. It runs it, and the output we get down here at the bottom is it prints hello world as we asked. The other thing that we talked about is you can also execute code interactively. And so we have the option of opening an interactive session where you can see down here at the bottom, instead of opening Python, running this file, and then closing Python, it's now open Python, run that code, and left Python open. So we now have this session running down here where we can keep working and explore the data that we're working with. I also mentioned that if we wanted, personally, when I'm working interactively, I prefer to split left and right, but this is a nice way for developing Python code in a simple way. The problem with this structure is that this Python console that we have over here on the right is really basic, right? As you can see, it's black and white. We don't get syntax highlighting. More importantly, though, we don't have the ability to do things like render HTML output that comes from Python or do things like open graphics and plots that we might create. This is less of an issue for a software engineer, but as a data scientist, there's going to be a lot of situations where what you want to do is take a data set and explore it by looking at plots and things like that interactively. So the tool that we have for kind of improving this experience is something called the interactive window, which is provided by the Jupyter ecosystem. And so I'll show you how to set this up in a few minutes, but what we can do is basically set up a tool so instead of executing your code in a vanilla Python console, we're running this against a program called IPython, which kind of comes from the Jupyter ecosystem and gives us tools like syntax highlighting and other nice tools for augmenting our experience. So, So we can still run code the same way where we highlight it, we run it over here on the side, and we can see where the output comes out. But we also get a lot more nice things like help files have syntax highlighting. The feedback over there is nice. If we want to see the state of our system, we can click over here on variables. This is getting a little bit big with everything expanded, but You can see all the variables that are defined in your current environment, which can be nice for introspection. But what's really especially nice about this is that we get the opportunity, oh, let me close that. There we go. But where this really shines is when we start looking at more interesting content. So I'm going to close this simple file. Sure, we'll save those changes. And I'm going to close this session. What I'm going to open instead is a file that I will link in the description below that does some slightly more sophisticated manipulations. So we can start by opening and loading a data frame. And if we run this code, you can start to see where you get a lot better experience from this interactive IPython console than we would get from the vanilla console. Again, everything looks a little bit strange with the text kind of enlarged to make it easily readable on the screen. I promise if you're working with your own computer with a regular font sizes, this looks a little bit less crowded. But we're going to get, there's just a moment to load. There we go. It's going to be a much richer representation of the data than what we can get when we're working with just the regular console. So I'll make the fonts a little bit smaller so you can see what it would look like if you were working with something normally. But we see that the tabular output, the summary of the data frame that we're working with, you know, we have these alternating colors between the different columns. If you don't have enough space, we get things like a scroll bar to allow you to kind of move back and forth around the data. That same tool for introspection that I mentioned before, where we can look at the variables that are in here, has augmentations for when we're working with data frames that are really nice, such as the fact that we can, let me close this little thing on the side, pull up the data frame as basically like a CSV file, basically. So if you're a person who really likes to be able to scroll through your data, this is a nice way to kind of explore a data frame in an interactive environment within VS Code. Just a nice way to get to know your data in a little bit more comfortable way. You can sort, you can filter in a lot of different ways. In addition, as I mentioned, if you're working with graphical data, oops, wrong key. One of the nice things about the interactive console is it renders HTML, and so we can do things like look at graphics that summarize our data and not only look at them, but we also get the opportunity to do things like work with, let me move this window back over a little bit so you can see better. There we go. But you can also get interactive features like mouse over behavior that allow you to kind of interact with your plots and work with them in different ways, in addition to just plotting them out there. And again, this comes from the fact that Jupyter is built on a web framework, and so it's giving us a lot of these web utilities and kind of the things that we've come to be comfortable with in the world of data science and the modern internet, kind of as a natural feature of our behavior. Now, in addition to this interactive console, we also have the ability to render Jupyter Notebooks natively within VS Code. If you haven't seen Jupyter Notebooks before, the basic idea is that they take your code and separate it into cells. And between cells, you also, and then you can run these cells, and the output of the cells will appear immediately beneath these notebook cells. Let me zoom out just a little bit and make this a little bit easier to see. So we can run this at the top. And these can be very nice because in addition to allowing you to put your code and the results of your code next to each other in a single document, you can also add cells that have things like markdown support. So for example, I could write the purpose, looking at GDP per capita and infant mortality. This notebook investigates the relationship between GDP per capita and infant mortality with a cross-country data set. That cell will render in Markdown, and you can do things like take these cells and you can move them around. So if you want to put one of these cells above another one, and so you end up with something that's referred to as a literate programming document, meaning that we get to combine discussion of what we're doing with regular English words alongside our code and the results of the code all in one document, which is a really nice tool. And then one of the last things that I will mention is that VS Code also has integration with an open source tool called NB-Convert that a lot of people are fond of, that allows you, if you are working with a Jupyter notebook like this, to move back to a .py file. So a lot of times people work in Jupyter notebooks to prototype their code and build it up. And what they want to do afterwards is maybe move back to a regular text file that they can then develop more, deploy on servers, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the tools that's very nice that you get from VS Code is you can export directly to a Python script. And what it does is it takes the markdown, puts it in commented blocks, and then it pulls out all the code cells and takes away everything else. So this can be a lot easier than going through a notebook and trying to copy all the content from every code cell, pasting it into a new plain text document. And so this is just a very popular feature that we also get for VS Code. All right, so that's enough motivation. The next thing I want to do is switch over to a version of VS Code that doesn't have all this set up yet and walk you through the process of setting this up and running it so that you can do this yourself. So let's do that next. Okay, so now we've switched over to the environment that we used in our last video, where all we've basically done is installed Miniconda and gotten VS Code set up to integrate with that particular Miniconda session. But as you may have noticed when we were installing Visual Studio Code's Python extensions, we got not just the Python extension installed, but it also came with a couple other tools, namely the Jupyter, Jupyter Keymap, and Jupyter Notebook Renderer. And that means that we've actually already managed to install everything that we need from the VS Code side to work with Jupyter tools. So what we're going to do now is set up our Python installation to ensure that that is also well configured in order to support using the Python tools. Now, in theory, there's the promise that VS Code is capable of installing these packages for you in the background. My own experience is that sometimes this doesn't work. So I think the first thing I'm going to suggest doing is that we open up a new terminal and we go ahead and install Jupyter. So we'll do new terminal. We're going to let that open up here and start up. And then I'm going to run conda install Jupyter. Now, this is going to bring with it all the tools that we need on the Python side of things to ensure that everything is going to run well. Okay, so that obviously took a couple minutes. There's quite a bit that gets installed with Jupyter. There are ways to do this with a lighter install, but at least in my experience, just installing Jupyter with conda install Jupyter is by far the best way to avoid any issues as you work with your conda environment. So now that we have that installed here, we're ready to start working with our different things. So let's start by just opening the file that we had been working with before, this my first Python script. And what I'm going to do is highlight a line of code, and instead of typing command enter or going down here to run selection in the Python terminal, right, which we did before, and just to remind you what it's going to look like, that opens up this terminal session, runs the bit of code, and then leaves open a Python session in a regular kind of vanilla Python terminal, right? So I can work down here, but as you can see, we're not getting any of those augmentations. So instead, what I'm going to do is select a bit of code, right click, and say run selection in interactive window. That's the name that Jupyter has for this kind of, that's the name that VS Code has for this interactive Jupyter-enabled IPython augmented console. It'll take a second for it to load up the first time. There we go. And it starts running. Now, one thing you'll notice right off the bat is there's a few differences between this and the session that I showed you before. The first one is that if I take a number of lines of code and I try to run those by going down to Run Selection and Interactive Window, what you will see is we don't see most of the code that was run. It's been collapsed so that we don't get to see it. We can unfold it by clicking on the three dots, but the default is that we don't get to see what's coming out over there. The other thing that's a bit of an issue is that obviously we don't want to have to run our code all the time by having to right-click and then go down to Run Selection or Line in the interactive window. So what we're going to do next is modify the modify a couple of the settings for the Jupyter extension such that when we type Shift-Enter, instead of that launching in the regular Python terminal in an interactive session, we will get an interactive window that we can work with. Now, there's a couple different ways we can get to these settings. And in fact, this is true for almost any setting in Visual Studio Code. So it's a nice Visual Studio Code, sorry. So this is a nice general thing to see. Visual Studio Code has this tendency of trying to improve discoverability, make it easier for you to discover its features and things by offering a lot of different paths to getting to the same thing. Right? So one of them, and perhaps the most obvious, is you go to the extension Jupyter, you click on the little gear here, and you say Extension Settings. And this is going to open up a little session. Let me close my interactive window here so we can see what's going on. And what's happened is we have this set of settings that are relevant for the extension. What you can see is by doing it that way, we've populated the search bar at the top with the name of this extension. So we're only seeing the settings that are relevant for this extension. What we're looking at, though, is actually just the generic settings window. And so if we delete this extension, we can also see all of the different settings that we might want to play with in VS Code. And so the other way that you can get to the settings for Jupyter is you can either go down to the gear in the bottom, choose Extensions. Oh, sorry. Go down to the gear at the bottom, choose Settings, and then just type in Jupyter. Or alternatively, as we've talked about before, everything in Jupyter is accessible from up here. And so one option is just to type Settings. And you have two options. One is Open User Settings JSON, and the other is Open Settings UI. UI is the user interface version of settings that has these nice explanations for what setting is. In a later video, I'll talk about JSON. That's kind of the underlying file that maintains all your settings in the language that Visual Studio Code knows, but using UI will get us to the interface that we really want. And again, we can type Jupyter. So the first thing I'm going to change is actually not just Jupyter, but in fact, interactive window. So we're going to search for interactive window settings. And the first one we want to change is this one. We want to send selection to interactive window when we type Shift-Enter. So this now changes the default behavior, this key code, so that if I go back to my script and I type Shift-Enter instead of opening an interactive Python session, we get a different session running over here. So let's type Shift-Enter. Instead of seeing the regular Python terminal open, we're going to see a new interactive session open up. It'll take a second to launch, and then it's going to run the output for that particular session. Now, the other setting I wanted to change relates to the collapsing of code. By default, this interactive window is not going to show you all the code it's run. It's going to take whatever block it is and collapse it unless you type these three dots. Personally, that's not my favorite. So again, I'm going to show you we're going to use the command prompt. We're going to open settings in the UI interface. I'm going to type interactive window just to search for the settings that are relevant. And I'm going to look for collapse cell input mode, and I'm going to say never. I would much prefer just always getting to see the code that I've run. So now we can close that. Now if I come back here, I don't know if I have to restart or not. Nope. Now we see that the code results are not being collapsed. So let me show you one or two things quickly about this interactive window so that you have a little bit more familiarity with what's going on. So the first thing to note is there's a restart. This is if you're working in a session, you've defined a bunch of variables, you've kind of lost track of what's going on, and you want to just start a clean session, you just hit restart. It'll give you a clean Python session running back there. You may also want to clear all to get all your output going away so you're working in a new place, and then you can just start over from scratch, writing your own code. If you don't want to write code in your Python file and instead just play around with a little code, obviously you can write your code down here and execute it with Shift+. Now, as I mentioned before, this variable button is going to give you a tool for introspection. It's going to show you variables that are currently defined in the current session. And then if for any reason you want to export the contents of this, you can save all of them either as a PDF or as a Python script. So if you want to save all the things that have been run in the interactive file, if you ran a bunch of code over there thinking you wouldn't use it and then you want it back, you can export that and save it as a Python script, and it'll give you all that output. The last thing to show you is this selection over here. This allows you to choose which current installation of Python on your computer you want to connect to for this interactive session, right? So this is another place where we get to choose what version of Python we want to be running against. Now, I will just flag, though we're not going to go into it here, Jupyter is actually not Python specific. The JU in Jupyter stands for Julia. The PY in Jupyter stands for Python, and the R at the end of Jupyter stands for R. And so you can actually use this with any of those programming languages, as well as a number of others that have since become offered support for these types of tools. So we're using this for Python right now, but you can also easily use this interface for any of those other languages if you want. Personally, I really appreciate that. I like having one interface for all my tools, so when I move between languages, I don't also have to move between different editor environments. So I find that very nice. Okay, so to create a new Jupyter notebook, the way we're going to do it is open up the command palette and type new notebook. And you can see the command for mine is already at the top because I was using it recently, but it should surface for you as well. So if you just type new Jupyter notebook, it'll come up to the top. And we'll get a new file that is a Jupyter notebook format. You can see the way it's presented has changed. Now, the first thing you want to do with a Jupyter notebook is save a copy of it. There's a number of weird little bugs that will come up if you're working a lot in a new notebook that hasn't been saved. So I'm just going to call this my first notebook. And then you need to keep this file suffix .ipynb. That's what identifies a file as a Jupyter notebook and helps VS Code know that it needs to render it as a notebook. So the idea of a Jupyter notebook is that it's a document that's divided into a series of cells, some of which contain code and some of which contain text written in a format called Markdown, which is a way of writing with simple characters, but still based on little codes in how you write. Computers can render it to have headings and italics and bold sections and things like that. So what you can see here at the top of our new notebook is the first cell, and at the moment the only cell in the notebook. You can see from the fact that it says Python in the bottom right that it's a code cell. So if I type some Python code in here, and then either I click this play button or I type Shift Enter, that code is going to run. Just like with the interactive window, it runs against the version of Python that's been selected over here. And when we run the cell, if it's the bottom cell, we're automatically going to get a new cell below it where we can add more Python code of various types. Now, the other type of cell, as I mentioned, is a text cell. So if I come down here and want to change this to be a text cell, I can click here and then select Markdown up at the top. And what I get now is a cell where I can type, this is my first notebook. And if I want to add a heading, I can use the syntax of Markdown and add # followed by first notebook. And when I'm done, I can either type Shift Enter to run the cell, or I can click this little plus mark. And you will see that Jupyter is going to render that by taking into account the things that I wrote, like that # to make the heading really big. You can drag around cells if you want, so you can reorder things like that, which makes it very easy to try to organize a document and play with it over time. Now, the last thing to note about Jupyter Notebooks is something that sometimes gets people into trouble. So A notebook is basically just a document that contains a lot of code. Now, if we run that code, the code gets executed against a Python session that's running in the background. But people sometimes run into trouble because they will do something like define a variable. Say here we've defined that x is equal to 7. They've run that code. So now in the Python session that's currently running, there's a variable called x that is equal to 7. And then when they're playing around with their notebook, somehow they delete that particular bit of code. Now, because this Python session is still running in the background, it hasn't closed, this x variable is still defined, even though the code that defined that variable is gone. And so if I ask this to run right now, that line of code will run fine, right? Because this Python session still has the variable x defined. But if I were to share this notebook with somebody else, and they tried to open a new Python session and run all of the code in this from top to bottom, what they would find is they would get an error because the code that defined that variable x is now gone. And so one of the good practices working with notebooks is from time to time you want to restart the kernel in the background of your notebook. Basically, this is saying let's create a new Python session with nothing defined in it. And then either run the cells from the top to the bottom or just click run all to execute all your code. What that's going to do is ensure that if previously you had code that only worked because you had defined something with code that you later deleted, you can go back and you can find that error because when you run it from the top, the fact that the code is missing means that you will run into a problem. So when you're working in Jupyter Notebooks, just from time to time, make sure that you go in and restart your kernel and run your code from the top to the bottom just to make sure that you know that were you to share this notebook with somebody else and they tried to start running it in a fresh session, that it would work okay. Oh, see? For example, there I learned that that x was inadvertently capitalized. So there you have it. So that's how you can use the tools from the Jupyter ecosystem within VS Code, including both the augmented console, what VS Code calls the interactive window, which you may be more familiar with as an IPython console, as well as having direct access to Jupyter Notebooks if that's your preferred development environment. So hopefully you find that useful. Thanks so much.